As of 1870, smart money might still bet that while the British Industrial Revolution had produced marvels of science and technology, it had not become the permanent and decisive watershed in human destiny. Had it lightened the toll of the overwhelming majority of humanity, even if Britain, the country at the leading edge? Doubtful. Had it materially raised the living standards of the overwhelming majority, even in Britain? By a little. Worldwide, the 1770 to 1870 British Industrial Revolution had been a big deal compared to everything that had come before. Steam power and iron making and spinning jennies and power looms and telegraph wires, they had provided comforts for the many, they had made fortunes for a few. But had how humans lived been transformed? No. And there were legitimate fears. What if there were to be a slowdown of invention, a disruption of societal institutions regulating fertility, or an exhaustion of key natural resources that supported industry? Then the pressure of higher population on resources, fewer smaller farm sizes, and fewer high-quality materials per worker might resume. It might well return humanity to the Malthusian stasis that Thomas Robert Malthus had outlined in his essay on the principle of population. Even as late as 1919, the very sharp John Maynard Keynes was not sure the escape was permanent. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he wrote, "Malthus disclosed a devil. For half a century, all serious economical writings held that devil in clear prospect. For the next half century, that is before 1913, the devil was chained up and out of sight. Now perhaps we have loosed him again." Yes, from 1770 to 1870, technological marvels became commonplace in the North Atlantic and visible throughout much of the world. But global population growth accelerated to about 0.5% per year. It was true that for the first time global production probably exceeded $3 per capita a day, but that 0.44% per year rate of growth of human technological and organizational capabilities, that growth rate typical of the Industrial Revolution era for the globe as a whole, could have been eaten up by global population growth of 0.9% per year. Without artificial means of birth control, with high infant mortality, and with a very strong desire to make sure have enough children to make sure some survive to take care of one's old age, should one be lucky enough to have an old age, a population living at $4 a year can and will sustain a 1.5% per year population growth rate. And a population living at $4 a day, it does not have low enough infant mortality for large-scale fertility reduction. To be something that's easily or something that's easily or straightforwardly accomplished. So, without the 1870 growth acceleration, without a further acceleration, a bigger than industrial revolution acceleration of the underlying drivers of economic growth, today's world might indeed be a steampunk world. It might have a global population of our current 7.5 billion, but one of people living at about the same global standard of living as 1870 or so, with global technology and organization at about the level of 1910. We might have not 9%, but rather more like 50% of the world living at or below $2 a day. We might have 90% living below 5 of today's dollars per day, with average farm sizes in that steampunk world 1/6 of what they had been in 1800. And only the uppermost of upper classes in that steampunk world would have what we might then regard as a global North standard of living. But we did get that extra post-1870 innovation growth acceleration. Around 1870, the proportional rate of growth of humanity's technological and organizational capabilities took a further fourfold upward leap, from perhaps 0.44% per year to our current 2.06% per year or so. Thereafter, technology has far outrun population growth. And thereafter, population growth, first in the richest economies and then in the others, began to decline. Humans became rich enough and long-lived enough that limiting fertility became a desirable option. Each year over 1870 to 1914, John Stuart Mill's belief that the progress of science and technology, of industry and enterprise, had not lightened the day's toil of any human being or effected great changes in human destiny. Each year after 1870, that belief became less and less true. By 1914, it had become more or less completely false. 1870 to 1914 was, in the perspective of all previous eras, as John Maynard Keynes, looking back from 1919, also wrote, a, quote, economic El Dorado, economic utopia. The earlier economists would have deemed it an unprecedented situation, an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of humanity. Globally, real wages of unskilled workers in 1914, wherever they lived, look like they stood more than half again above their level of 1870 or so. A worldwide escape from Malthus never before seen. The resulting world as of 1914, it was an odd mix of modernity and antiquity. Britain burned 194 million tons of coal in 1914. The total coal equivalent energy of consumption of Britain today is only 2.5 times that. Yet 1870 still saw close to half of Americans working outside the home at work in agriculture, and 1914 saw that true of a third. And all European countries, with the exception of Belgium and Britain, were behind America in their distribution of the labor force between town and country, and among farming, manufacturing, and other sectors. U.S. railroads carried passengers some 350 miles per citizen in 1913. Back before the coronavirus plague, U.S. airlines carried passengers 3,000 miles per citizen per year. And yet, in spite of that modernity, still all of Europe, save France in 1914, saw the powerful political and social dominance of agrarian landlords, who still mostly saw themselves as descendants of the knights who had fought with their kings for their swords. Why did each year since 1870 see as much technological and organizational progress as 4 years over the Industrial Revolution era of 1770 to 1870, and of 60 years over the years before 1500? And what was originally a geographically concentrated surge in Northwest Europe become global, albeit unevenly global? We can gesture to 5 changes. Surely the most important was the development of the Industrial Research Laboratory. This meant that inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla could be inventors. They did not have to fulfill the 10 other roles that their predecessors had had to fill before them, from impresario to human resources manager. This made a huge difference. Inventions could be professionally developed and then rapidly and thoroughly deployed at scale, in the form first of the mass production multi-divisional corporation, and now of the looser organizations that are our global value chains. Invention could become rationalized and routinized. And closely following importance, as I already mentioned, the coming of the modern corporation. Only knowledge diffused is knowledge useful, and the corporation was the way the knowledge got out of the industrial research lab and down to the production line. Once again, large-scale rationalization and routinization. Plus, we had 3 more. The globalization of world transport, in the form of the iron-hulled, screw-propellered, ocean-going steamship linked to the railroad network, and subsequent follow-on developments. 4, the globalization of communication, in the form of the global telegraph, especially including the global submarine telegraph. And 5, the lack of barriers, a political decision. The most important was open borders for migration, with the important caveat that the poorest from China, India, and elsewhere were not allowed into the temperate settlements, though it was reserved for Europeans, and sometimes Middle Easterners. About 1 in 10 humans changed their continent between 1870 and 1914. But also important was the lack of government blockages to trade and investment and communication. Not only was it the fact that people could and did move, but finance machines, railroads, steamships, and the telegraph nerves of production and distribution could follow, chasing abundant natural, physical, and biological resources. And then there is what is perhaps the most important consequence of this third modern watershed. For reasons we do not well understand, the richer economies of 1870 to 1914 rapidly became ones in which mass politics was no longer an occasional outlier, but was instead the rule. Elites found that maintaining old hierarchies of political domination and exclusion from power were no longer viable, and that they must instead either educate their new populist masters to the practices of rational self-government, or find a way to bamboozle them.